Okay, so today we're going to have a look at some BBC News and we're going to have a look at the latest news on Macron counting on Xi to bring Russia to senses. So we're going to have a look at this as a pronunciation and reading exercise where I'm going to read this article out loud and I would like you to uh, use this as a platform to practice your own pronunciation. So after each sentence or paragraph, you can pause the video and try and copy what I said in the same voice that I did. So, French leader Emmanuel Macron has urged his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping to help stop Russia's war in Ukraine. I know I can count on you to bring Russia to its senses and bring everyone back to the negotiating table, he told Mr. Xi in Beijing. Mr. Xi said China and France had the ability and responsibility to safeguard world peace, but Moscow said there were no prospects for a peaceful settlement so far and its offensive would continue. Mr. Macron is on state visit to China that would be highly scrutinized after years of deteriorating relations between the West and China, which has refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Macron is also seeking to bolster trade ties. He is joined by European Commissioner Chief Ursula von der Leyen, who he invited to take part in talks with the Chinese leadership, as well as a large business delegation. On Thursday afternoon, Mr. Macron was treated to an elaborate military parade in Beijing before entering closed-doors talks with Mr. Xi, which Chinese and French officials described as frank and friendly. Speaking to the press afterwards, Mr. Xi said China advocates for peace talks and seeks a political solution, and called for rational restraint from the international community. He also reiterated that nuclear weapons should not be used in the conflict. Russia said earlier this week it plans to place tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, near the Allies' western border with NATO countries. Mr. Macron said, "We can't have a safeguard and stable Europe as long as Ukraine remained occupied, that it was unacceptable that a member of the UN Security Council had violated the organization's charter." The French leader struck a cordial tone in his speech, often turning to Mr. Xi during the press conference and addressing him directly. It stood in contrast to Mr. Xi's impassive delivery to the press. In a separate press conference later, Mrs. van der Leyen stressed that if China provided arms to Russia, it would be against international law and significantly harm the relationship between the EU and China. She also said she expected Beijing to play a role that promotes a just peace and that she stood firmly behind Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky peace plan, which calls for the complete withdrawal of Russian troops. China has released its own peace plan, which Western nations have been generally dismissive of, saying it sides too much with Russia, but Mr. Zelensky has expressed interest in it and called for direct talks with Mr. Xi, who has yet to publicly respond. But Mrs. von der Leyen said during the discussion with Mr. Xi, he reiterated willingness to speak to Mr. Zelensky when the conditions and timings are right. On Thursday, Russia acknowledged that China has a very effective and commanding potential for mediation, but the situation with Ukraine is complex, so there are no prospects of a peaceful settlement, said the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who added that Russia had no choice but to continue the war. Mr. Macron is being hosted at a state dinner on Thursday night, and on Friday, the two will travel to the southern city of Guangzhou, where they will dine again together privately. The trip marks the most politically significant interaction Mr. Xi has had with a Western leader since he met US President Joe Biden in November at the G20 summit in Bali last November. With the visit, Mr. Macron, who has been kept keen to burnish his credentials as an international peace broker, has now personal contact with all major players in the Ukraine conflict. Observers believe he knows he is unlikely to come back from the China trip with any major diplomatic achievements to boast of. The chances of Mr. Xi changing his views on Russia and Ukraine in any significant way are, to say the least, small. Mr. Macron is likely to emphasize the small advances points in common and the benefits of engagement through trade and talk. He said to believe that just because France is part of the Western alliance and close to the US does not mean it cannot deepen its relations with China, which is allied with Russia, allied to Russia. In his remarks to the press, the French leader mentioned little of China's human rights issues and perennial point of connection between China and the West, but said that while they remain important to France, it's better to be respectful than to lecture. Mr. Macron's trip also saw several significant deals signed by French and Chinese corporations and the cultural institutions witnessed by him and Mr. Xi. He is traveling with a delegation comprising business leaders, artists, and museum officials. They included top executives from a plane manufacturer Airbus, luxury group LVMH, and nuclear energy provider EDF. The trip to Beijing, 4 years after Mr. Macron last paid a visit to Mr. Xi, takes place during the strikes and unrest in France over unpopular reforms to the pension system. Okay, we'll finish there.